Hi, this is Chris Eboch. Welcome to Myths About Writing for Children. If you are a beginner in writing for children or just getting interested, you'll get a thorough overview of the entire industry. If you have some experience, I hope you will still find some tidbits that might be new to you and some areas to explore more. This was supposed to be live for the SouthWest Writers meeting on May 2nd, but because of our isolation guidelines, I'm doing it from my home as a recording. If you'd like to get into more detail on plotting, I hope that you will join me on May 2nd for a live Zoom meeting. That talk will be What I Learned from Nancy Drew, Tools for Fast-Paced Plotting. And we'll talk about some of the important things you need to do when writing a strong story. Great dramatic openings, chapters that end on a strong twist, and making sure you have plenty of action. This talk will not be just for children's book writers. It'll be appropriate for novelists of all types, for all ages, and even for people writing memoirs or nonfiction, because every story or article can benefit from strong plotting techniques. If you'd like to sign up for that talk, you can call the SouthWest Writers office or use the online registration form. If you need to make notes, you can pause the recording, and I'll also bring this slide up again at the end. So let's jump right into Writing for Children, 5 Myths. The first one is a two-part myth. Part one is that you won't ever sell your work or you won't make any money, because obviously people like artists and writers can't actually make a living off of their work. Curiously, the second part of the myth is the opposite, that you'll get rich and famous. And this came about in the era of Harry Potter and Twilight, when a few books and authors became multimillionaires and gave people the idea that this was a quick way to make a lot of money. The truth is that very few people get rich. Of course, we hear the very unusual success stories. I've heard the statistic that about 5 people who are full-time children's book authors make a living from their writing. Now that means they're working at it full-time, not just in the summer when teachers are off school and doing some writing. They're not stay-at-home parents who are only writing a couple of hours a week. Those people, of course, probably aren't expecting to make a full-time living. But many people make a few thousands a year, or maybe one year they sell a book and make $10,000, and the next year they don't make anything, and the year after that they sell a few articles or short stories and make a few hundreds of dollars. So there can be quite a lot of variety depending on your experience level, the kinds of things you write, and how much time you put into it. But it's not all about making money. So if this is an area that interests you, please explore it, have fun with it. It's a way that you can enjoy writing and feel like you're doing something good by creating stories for young people. Just as an example, one year I didn't sell a novel, so I didn't get any money from an advances on novels. However, The Well of Sacrifice, which had been published previously, was earning royalties, and I got a royalty check in the spring and another in the fall. So that brought in a little bit of money. I was also self-publishing and brought out a middle grade historical novel as well as a writing guide, and those brought in a little bit of money. And then I did work for hire books. That means a publisher had a topic they wanted a book on, and they hired an author, and they told me exactly what they wanted in terms of grade level, length, topic, and so forth. I also wrote magazine articles, a lot of them on writing topics, so they're actually for adults, but about writing for children. I did quite a few critiques, which can bring in anywhere from $50 for a picture book critique to several $100s for a novel critique. I did some teaching in person and online. I also wrote educational test passages. Those are the horrible tests that students have to take at the end of the school year in order to see how the school as a whole is doing. And I did one school visit. I don't do a lot of those. Some authors do far more, and they can be either in person or online, and probably more online these days. So types of publishing, since I've already mentioned a few, are traditional, where a publisher pays you. So you might write your novel or your picture book without anybody promising to publish it. Then you send it to agents who represent you to publishers, or you find publishers who will accept the query for the manuscript. If a publisher is interested and they only acquire maybe 5% of the books that are sent to them, then they will offer you a contract. They will hire the illustrator. They will do all of the production for the book, the editing, the proofreading, the cover design, and so forth. They will release it and market it. The advance is the money that you get up front. And then if the book sells well enough, you may also start getting a royalty, which is money for every book sold after that initial advance money has been essentially paid back. So if you get $5,000 up front and your royalty rate is $1 per hardcover book, the first 5,000 books you sell will go to earn out your advance, and anything that you sell after that would pay a royalty. That's a bit of a simplification, but good enough for today. Self-publishing is where you have complete control. So nobody can tell you that you can't publish your book, but also nobody helps or puts in money. So you hire the cover artist, or if you're doing a picture book, you hire the artist to do the interior illustrations. If you need an editor or a proofreader or a designer, you have to hire all of those people. You can either get a print run done of, say, 1,000 books, which then you have to figure out how to sell and distribute yourself, or you can set it up as print on demand through Amazon or the distributor Ingram. You also have to do all of the marketing. So there are definitely advantages to self-publishing. You have complete control and you can put it out on your schedule, but you do have to do all the work and put up the money up front. Another term you may hear is vanity publishing, and that is where a company tells you that they're accepting your book for publication, but that you need to put up money for it. So there may be times with self-publishing where you choose to hire somebody, but if a publisher says they want to publish your book and you thought it was a traditional publisher, but they're asking you for money, that is a vanity publisher, which is a scam, and you should avoid that one. Myth 2 in writing for children is that it means either novels for middle grade or young adult, or it means picture books. I had a friend that I'd known for several years through rock climbing, and I was talking about my Mayan middle grade novel, and he said, "Oh, I thought you wrote fluffy bunny books." So that is an idea that a lot of people have. They just aren't aware of all the vast variety that there is in children's books. So let's get into a little bit of detail there. Starting at the youngest, there are picture books, which can be anywhere from birth, where you might see the small, square, stiff paper books called board books that have maybe no text at all, just pictures or very simple text. Or they can be for a little bit older kids, either to be read aloud to a child sitting on the lap, or at a certain point, the child may start reading these picture books themselves. Typically, they are either 16 or 32 pages, and that's not, and somewhere between that, that's exactly 16 or exactly 32, and that has to do with the way the books are printed. The interior pages are printed on a large sheet of paper, which is then folded and cut, and so those big sheets of paper come and make for sets of 8 pages. And that's why you may hear that a picture book has to be a certain number of pages, and it's not really negotiable. But of course, you can have some pages that are just illustration, some pages where maybe there's text and illustrations that are different on each side of the book, and some where the illustration covers both sides of the spread. In picture books, every page should have art, and the art should be different from the other pages. Not completely different. You may have the same setting and the same characters, but the pages shouldn't all look the same, or that gets boring. So you want characters who are moving, who are doing things, who have different expressions. You may have the background change somewhat to reflect what's going on. You do not need to find an illustrator if you are approaching traditional publishers with your picture book. They would much rather hire a professional illustrator themselves. Chances are that the people you know who are good at art are not professional children's book illustrators. And even if they want to be, They may not have all the skills, or they may not have the style that the publisher wants for your book. So if you find an illustrator first, you actually hurt your chances of selling that book for most publishers. There are a few very small publishers who prefer that the author and illustrator approach them as a team, but that's unusual. Now, if you are the illustrator and your work is professional quality and you know how to get the digital files that the publisher is going to want, you can certainly then present yourself as an author illustrator and try to do both pieces of it. For a first-time author of a picture book, you might be offered $1,000 to $5,000, maybe a bit more if they think it's going to be a really big hit, but don't expect a lot of money up front. Also, I read one statistic that half of published picture book authors wrote 6 or more stories before selling one. So if you're writing picture books, it's a good idea to brainstorm lots of ideas and work on the ones that you think are best and really perfect your craft by writing multiple picture books. Don't just choose one idea and write it and edit it and edit it and edit it and get critique feedbacks and work only with that one story, because maybe that's not the idea that's going to be a great book. I have heard for years that what editors really like are character-driven picture books with series potential. So what that means is that the character in the picture book has a strong personality. They have something that really makes them stand out. So for Fancy Nancy, it's a little girl who likes everything sparkly and shiny and ruffled and bowed. She likes things fancy. And the first book is just sort of about that and her family not really getting that aspect of her, but coming together in the end. But because she had such a strong personality, it was easy for the author to take that character and put her in other situations. Same with Skippy John Jones, the kitten who wants to be a Chihuahua, and Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus, where the pigeon has a strong personality of really wanting to drive a school bus. Those characters could be put in different situations. So you can move them to a first day of school story, a holiday story for Christmas or Halloween, or any other number of interesting situations. And series sell big. So one book, it's hard to market, but the next books, it gets a little bit easier to market. So that's just something to think about, is make sure that you have a character with a lot of strong personality when you're writing picture books. Picture books should have a beginning, middle, and end. Now that sounds a little weird because, of course, if you write it, it's going to start somewhere and it's going to end somewhere. And it's going to have stuff in the middle. But what that really means is it has to get off to an interesting start with a situation, a problem, maybe a goal that the character wants to solve. The middle should relate to that problem or goal, and the end should solve it. It should build to a climax, so things should get more dramatic or exciting over time. The character should grow and change over the course of the book. So with picture books, you don't need a huge dramatic problem. It's not a character trying to save the world from great evil. It might be a character trying to figure out how to deal with a new baby in the house, or the first day of school, or just not wanting to go to bed. So those simple problems and goals work, but you still need some kind of problem or goal. Otherwise, it's what might be called a slice of life story, or a story that's too quiet, not much happens. Generally going to have few characters. You can have sometimes characters in the background who are never named and don't have dialogue. That can be a fun way to have, say, a little animal in the background who's doing something while the main story is going on. But often that would be the illustrator's choice. So keep things fairly simple, one main plot, limited characters, but make sure that you do have a plot. Short is good when it comes to picture books. If you're starting out, you might find that your first drafts go over 1,000 words. And that might be because you're putting a lot of setting in, you're telling what the characters are thinking, you're really trying to tell the complete story, but you have to remember that the pictures tell a large part of the story. So publishers have been liking shorter than 500 words. Some of them even really like shorter than 300 words. And that might sound impossible, but it really does work. So this book, Police Officers on Patrol by New Mexico author Kirsten Hamilton, it's actually only 150 words. And yet it not only tells a story, it tells a story in essentially 3 chapters. So it's about police officers, and it has these 3 little chapters about things that they deal with. So a broken light might cause a crash. Who can help? Who is fast? That's one double-page spread. Turn the page, Officer Mike on traffic patrol, and then you see Officer Mike helping the turtles cross the road. Turn the page again, it's back to the dispatcher saying, uniform, badge, radio, officer responding, go Mike, go. Flip the page again, situation under control, when people need help, we rock and roll. And that shows Officer Mike helping with traffic. So right there is essentially a chapter of this book that tells a little story about this police officer helping people. And the book has 3 of those. So that's an example of how you can really tell a story in very few words. So if you're interested in writing picture books, read a lot of them. You might also want to try a picture book dummy. This is where you draw squares for the pages of your picture book, so say 16 of them, and you figure out what's going to be on each page. So which text is going to be on each page? What kind of illustrations might work there? You don't have to share this with the editor. It's just for yourself to make sure that your text will distribute across those pages in a smart way, and that you'll have illustrations that are different from each other and interesting and exciting. So you don't have to be a good artist, as my example shows. It's just to give you an idea of how that picture book will flow. A subset of this myth is that picture books are all sweet and cute. And certainly there are some very sweet, cute picture books, but that doesn't mean all of them have to be. It's fine to tackle tough subjects. Almost to Freedom by New Mexico author Vonda Michaud Nelson deals with slavery in a historical setting, but is told through the story of this little girl with a doll. So it's something that's accessible for children. You can have more issue-driven books. So I Miss You, A First Look at Death, or Taking Diabetes to School. Most publishers won't do this type of book, but there are some who specialize in it. So they're nonfiction topics that help kids deal with things that they're dealing with. Another myth about picture books is that they should rhyme. And of course, everybody knows Dr. Seuss, and that rhyme is really fun. But don't try to imitate Dr. Seuss. Publishers see far too much of that, and it doesn't interest them. If you want to read a great rhyming book, Chicka Chicka Boom Boom is really fun and worth checking out. So a strong rhyme can help sell a picture book, but they certainly do not have to rhyme, and it can be better if they don't. Unless you're a very experienced poet, please write in prose. And even if you want to rhyme, I suggest that you write a draft without rhyming so that you make sure you really focus on that character development and plot instead of just trying to focus on making things rhyme. So this is another book by Vonda Michaud Nelson, historical nonfiction picture book. And it starts, Jim Webb's luck was running muddy when Bass Reeves rode into town. Webb had stayed 1 jump ahead of the lawman for 2 years. He wasn't about to be caught now. So you can see there's no rhyme there, but there's interesting language. It's vivid and exciting and has some flavor to it of the time. So don't worry about rhyming. If you want to practice rhyme and become a really expert poet, that's fine. But if you're not already familiar with rhythm and meter and perfect rhyme versus imperfect and so forth, just focus on writing great characters and a strong plot and don't worry about rhyming. Picture book topics are things that relate to kids' lives. So bedtime, school, a new sibling. The problem is these are also topics that have been done hundreds of times before. So if you're tackling them, you need to find a new angle. So that's why Who's That Snoring, a Pull the Tab bedtime book, is a different angle on bedtime. It's about snoring, and it's also a pull the tab book, so it has an interactive element. So babies don't eat pizza and we don't eat our classmates. You can just tell from the covers and the titles that those are a little bit different from the typical You Have a New Baby or First Day of School book. So look for new angles if you're going to touch on those kinds of really common topics. Diversity of all types is really big these days in books for kids of all ages. And that is certainly true of picture books, whether it is same-sex parents, transgender children, stories from other cultures, fiction and nonfiction, showing different kinds of mental and physical abilities. So you shouldn't try to write that book just to hit that market, because editors are going to want to know why you're the right person for this book. So if you write a book about a child in a wheelchair because you just thought that would be a way to get the book to sell, you're probably not going to succeed. But if you write about a child in a wheelchair because you were in a wheelchair as a child, then you have a much better chance. Publishers really want people to write from their own experiences when they're tackling these kinds of diverse topics. And picture books are not just fiction. There's a variety of nonfiction, from biographies of interesting people. Again, diversity is a big topic right now. So not just white men from history, but people of color and women, especially women in the sciences. So you can always look for unusual people who would make great biographical subjects. And if you want to do that, read a lot of the biographies that are out there to see what works in this picture book format. Also, there's books on science and reading and more educational topics. Often those are work for hire, so the publisher is looking to hire writers to do those specific topics. And then there are those issue books such as illnesses and so forth. So again, study the market, see what's already out there, see who is publishing what, and that can help give you some guidance on whether your idea might work. Now, I said books don't have to rhyme, and that's certainly true, but poetry is one aspect of picture books. And that can be collections of poetry, which usually have a theme, such as Button Up, rhymes about clothing, or What's for Dinner, which was poetry about animals eating. Again, diversity is also big. So if you are a poet and you want to write poems for kids, you might look at selling individual poems to magazines. You also might think about a collection that could work as a book, and make sure that they are tied together by a strong theme. Folk tales are not as popular these days as they have been in the past, but there are certainly still occasional folk tales that sell, and again, unusual stories from parts of the world other than white Europe are going to be probably of most interest to publishers, simply because we've had so much of the white European stories that they're looking for other ways to show people what the whole world is like. There's a saying in children's books that kids need windows and mirrors. So the mirrors let kids see themselves, and a lot of children have not seen themselves in books in the past. So we're trying to show every child themselves in books. And the windows allow children to see kids who are different from them, so they learn more about the world. Moving up in age range, we have early readers. These are books that are specifically designed for kids who are learning to read. So you'll see that these have numbers on them, and those are the levels of the readers. So you start at level 1 for kids who are really just learning to read for the very first time. Very short stories, simple language, super short sentences. And then each step goes a little bit more complex so that they can learn to read in stages. These books are all by New Mexico author Shirley Ray Redmond, and you'll see again that there's a lot of variety. There's science topics, history, and fiction. This is a tricky area to write. It requires following guidelines very closely, but because it's hard, not a lot of people attempt it. So if it's an area that you think might work for you, go and read a whole bunch of early readers, figure out who publishes them, get the publisher's guidelines. They can be very specific in terms of how many words, what kind of vocabulary, sometimes how many maximum number of sentences, of words per sentence, and sentences per paragraph, and so forth. So this is one publisher's example of just the lowest level of reading. And here's an example from the Scholastic Hello Readers. So a level 2 book, oh no, I can't play. I can't play with you, Freddie. Not now. Can't you see I am eating spaghetti? So other than the word spaghetti, those are very simple words. There's repetition. I can't play with you. And this is level 2, so it's not even the easiest level, but short, simple, not too many words per line. Level 3 is a little bit more complex. On the day she arrived, Miss Sullivan gave Helen a doll. D-O-L-L spells doll, said Miss Sullivan. So you can see how over time each level gets a little bit more advanced to help kids learn to read. Moving up in age range, again, we hit middle grade novels. So these are novels for kids that are pretty fluent readers, although some of them may still struggle, or they may be what's known as reluctant readers. They just don't like reading very much. So some of these may still be fairly short books with simpler language. They may have illustrations inside, just to make it a little bit easier for those kids who aren't enthusiastic or expert readers yet. But they can also be longer and more complex. They can be fantasy, science fiction, historical. In fact, schools will sometimes use this kind of book to teach kids about those different genres. So a school might have a program where over the course of the year, kids have to read one historical novel, one fantasy novel, one contemporary fiction, and so forth. Again, diversity is big, and if you come from a background that could be considered diverse, then that's certainly something that you might draw on. If you don't come from that kind of background, I wouldn't tackle it because, like I said, these days, publishers really want own voices story. So that means the person has personal experience with whatever they're writing about when it comes to people of color. But if you do have that background, then definitely explore it and feel perfectly comfortable writing your story. Again, tough topics are not out of line here. Some people assume that even in middle grade, you're not dealing with really serious things, but you certainly can be. So Lucky Broken Girl was about a Cuban Jewish girl who was in a car accident and seriously injured and in bed for many months. And so this is the author's experience, and she's written it in novel form. Nest is about a girl whose mother has physical and mental illnesses, and Brave deals with bullying. So tough topics can certainly be addressed in these middle grade books. They're going to tend to have happy endings and be uplifting over time. Young adult novels, young adult means teen in this case. They're typically ages 12 to 18. Sometimes that's broken down a little bit more. A book may be identified as for ages 12 to 14 or for ages 16 and up. They can have a greater age range. They can go up to 70,000 words or so, sometimes even more. 25,000 would really be on the shorter end here, but might be okay for certain types of books. You'll see that the advances, the potential higher advances, are going up as the age range goes up. That may be partly because adults sometimes read young adult novels. Young adult novels are actually fairly popular with women in their 20s and 30s in particular. So you can have a larger audience for that reason. As in middle grade novels, you can have historical topics, science fiction, fantasy. You can also have more realistic topics and tough subjects. The main difference between middle grade and YA, well, first of all, the age of the character. Conventional wisdom is that kids like to read about characters their own age or a little bit older. They don't as much like to read about younger characters. So a 13-year-old isn't going to read about a 10-year-old typically. Kids are looking forward. They're looking forward to being older. And so they're not as interested in younger characters, although there are exceptions. Second is the language can be a little bit different. It might be more sophisticated or advanced for young adult, not necessarily. And another important aspect is simply the way a subject is handled. So Silent to the Bone actually deals with child abuse, and it is a middle grade novel. In this story, the main character's best friend has been accused of hurting his baby sister and showing an unnatural interest in her. The friend has been put into an institution because he will not speak. So the main character goes to visit his friend, shows him note cards with words or names, and the friend points to one, and then the main character goes and investigates and figures out what really happened. So this is a tough subject, but it's done at a little bit of a remove. It's not the main character who is accused of these horrible things and in an institution. It's his friend, so that gives the reader a little bit of a distance as well. And it is revealed in the end that it wasn't this best friend boy who did these things. It was, well, I won't spoil it, but it was another character in the book. So it's a mystery novel. It's got a lot of drama to it. It does deal with tough subjects, but you don't get a lot of on-the-page horror. On the other hand, Ellen Hopkins is a fabulous young adult writer who does novels in verse. So the story is told through a series of poems. Crank deals with the main character as a drug addict. Other stories deal with teen pregnancy, incest, the toughest subjects. And of course, there are some adults who say that kids shouldn't be reading these stories, but Ellen gets fan mail all the time that says, "You helped me, you saved me, you realized that I was not alone in going through this. You gave me a way to start talking to my cousin who is getting into prostitution." So she is a popular writer, and also she does a lot of good in the world by tackling these tough subjects. So that was more about content, but looking at format, graphic novels are fairly popular for both middle grade and young adult. So these are not just necessarily novels told fully in cartoon. They may be a mix of larger blocks of text plus illustrations, or they may be entirely graphic. Again, this helps those kids who are not enthusiastic readers or not expert readers because there's a lot of visual material. And of course, it's also just a fun way to tell some of these stories. They can be lighter topics, they can be more serious, they can deal with the same kind of diversity that we've seen in other formats. And then let's not neglect nonfiction. So often nonfiction for middle grade and young adult is for the school library market. So these are not books that you would necessarily see in a bookstore, but they may be in public libraries or school libraries. Often these are work for hire books. So the publisher has an idea for a series and they look for authors to write them. So these are a sampling of some of the books I've done. So Living with Dyslexia was one of a series of living with health challenges. Other authors wrote the other books in those series. You can see the wide variety of topics. So work for hire writers benefit if they can research and write about basically anything. So science, history, modern issues, and so forth. If you really want to only write on a narrow range of subjects, work for hire might not be the best place. But if you like learning about a lot of things, if you don't mind a deadline that might be only 6 weeks away, if you can write to a specific grade level and a specific word count, then work for hire can be a way to make some money. And the authors who make a modest living doing writing full time for young people tend to do a lot of this kind of work for hire. It can be much more steady income, whereas if you're writing novels or picture books, you have to do all that writing up front and there's no guarantee that it will ever sell. For this kind of book, you sign a contract in advance and then you write the book. You can also write original nonfiction for middle grade and young adult. So this is where the author comes up with an idea. You might not have to write the entire book before selling it. You might write a proposal, an outline, a couple of sample chapters, and then send that to publishers to see who might be interested. So these books by Lori-Ann Thompson, Two Truths and a Lie. This is a science one, and she also has one that's about history. And it tells nonfiction stories about science, 2 of which are true and 1 which is not true, but they all sound kind of weird and unlikely. And then the kids get to try to analyze which one might be the lie. And then, of course, the book does give the answer. Be a change maker, how to start something that matters. Teens tend to be particularly interested in making the world a better place. So that's a nonfiction topic of, to help them do that. That would be of interest. I do want to touch briefly on magazines because that's often an area that's overlooked. And there's hundreds of magazines for kids on different topics. So Jack and Jill has a health topic. Magnifikids is a religious magazine. Hopscotch is for girls, Boys Quest is for boys, and of course most people are familiar with highlights. So fiction, nonfiction, different angles of what they're looking for. The nonfiction can be broken down sometimes into science, history. Chem Matters is specifically for high school chemistry students. Some of these magazines have theme lists, which means maybe for Odyssey, this theme was science about blood. For Cobblestone, the theme was the cavalry in the Civil War. So you would want to find out what themes they have coming up and what the deadlines are for submitting articles about those themes. So it's a good idea if you're interested in history or science to make a reminder on your calendar to check their theme lists a couple of times a year, see what's coming up. If it's something that doesn't interest you, don't bother. But if there is a theme that is in your wheelhouse, maybe try to pitch an article about it. You want to check the guidelines carefully. Often magazines will have a specific word count, like Highlights doesn't take stories or articles longer than 800 words. That means if you send them 1,000 words, they're not going to take it. And that's because magazines have a certain number of pages for every issue. They have a certain number of articles, stories, poems, other features they want in each issue. They can't simply add pages. So you really need to study those guidelines and be accurate. You're not likely to make very much money writing for magazines. They don't pay a lot per word, and the word count is typically low. But it can be a fun way to get your work out there in the world. Everybody knows Highlights. So if you have a story or article published in Highlights, it's something that you can really show off to your friends. And it can also look good on a cover letter. If you haven't had a novel or a picture book published, but you're sending a query to an agent or editor, you can let them know that you have been published in magazines, and that shows you're a serious writer. There are a few magazines that pay well. Chem Matters, I think, pays around $800 per article now. So if you're interested more in making money, then you'd want to look for those magazines that actually pay well. Magazines can also be a great way to learn about the interests and the language for kids of different ages. So the bug group, baby bug, ladybug, spider, cricket, cicada, each of those is for a different age range. So by getting a couple of issues of each magazine, you can really see how interests change, how language changes as the age range goes up. American Girl, Girl's Life, 17. Again, different age ranges, and you can see just from the covers, from the story ideas, and from the way the girls are portrayed that American Girl is a bit younger. Girl's Life is getting more into fashion and beauty. And so, like I said, it's a way to see what interests kids of different ages and what language works for them. Moving on to myth 3, real life makes good stories. Often beginning writers pull something out of their life, something that happened with their children, with their grandchildren, and it was cute and it was funny, and so they want to turn it into a story. The problem is typically that means there isn't really a plot. Often it also means that if there is a problem, the child didn't solve it. Maybe the child got in some kind of trouble and the adult came in and rescued them. Or maybe there's an important lesson to learn. Those are the kind of stories that appeal to adults who want to teach kids. They don't appeal to kids who want to be the heroes in their stories. So the truth behind this myth is that you can certainly use something that happened in real life as inspiration, but be willing to fictionalize it. Make sure that the child character is the main character. They're the one with a problem or goal. Make sure that child works to solve the problem and reach that goal. And make sure the child succeeds through their own actions. Don't have a parent, grandparent, teacher, fairy godmother, mythical creature come in and fix things. That ties into myth 4, that children's stories should teach moral lessons. Would you want to read stories that felt like they were just teaching you how you should be? Kids get an awful lot of that already, of what they should do and how they should do it. So kids like us read for entertainment. Nonfiction is actually very popular with young people because certain young people really like collecting information. It's like the kids who learn all the baseball statistics. Nonfiction is like a currency. It has value to them. But for fiction, they want great characters. They might be interested in different settings, whether it's sometime in the past or the future or another planet. They typically want action in their stories. They may want humor. Of course, not every book has to be a humorous book, but there are some kids that you're only going to reach through humor. And they may also like being exposed to new ideas. So make sure that you are treating kids with the same respect that you would for adults. You're not writing sermons for them, unless perhaps you're writing for a religious magazine. You're writing fun, exciting stories that they will enjoy. Myth 5 is that writing for children is easier than writing for adults. And if you have kids at home now that you're trying to teach and keep entertained, you probably already know that this is not going to be true. Kids are a tough audience. I think we all have shorter attention spans than perhaps in previous generations, and that certainly can be true for kids. There's a lot of competition from TV, games. When they can go out of their houses, they may play sports. They may want to hang out with friends. So if you want them to read a book, it has to be a book that has the same appeal of hanging out with their friends or playing something. A lot of kids, unfortunately, don't like reading very much. It may be a struggle for them. They may be struggling with diagnosed or undiagnosed dyslexia or another learning disability, or they may simply have only gotten books in school that they don't enjoy. So if you can produce that book that is the first book a kid read willingly and loved, that is a wonderful and powerful thing. When writing for kids, you also have to keep in mind the reading level for each grade or age. So if the younger you're writing, the simpler the language has to be. With the exception that picture books which are read aloud don't necessarily have to have the simplest language. There also can be those length limits. So you can't simply write a 100,000 word novel that has very advanced language and delves into the socio-political situation in another world and expect teenagers to be interested. You have to focus on appealing to what they like in language that they can enjoy. So writing for kids is not easy, but the good news is that you can get help. There are lots of books and magazines on the craft and business of writing, including my book, You Can Write for Children. There are professional organizations such as the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. The group meets monthly. Now we're doing it on Zoom as opposed to in person. And the group puts on workshops and retreats in New Mexico. Again, hard to say exactly how that's going to happen over the next year, but definitely find out what's going on with SCBWI. The group sends out a weekly email that has information about webinars, monthly meetings, and so forth. And you can sign up by just sending an email to that email address and asking to be on the list. There's also plenty of conferences, workshops, classes. These days, more of them are online. In the future, you might be able to attend live. So take advantage of some of these opportunities, including my talk on May 2nd, What I Learned from Nancy Drew, Tools for Fast-Paced Plotting. Again, this tells you how you can register, and you can pause the slide if you need to take notes. So, quick summary: to write successful stories for kids, make sure you're telling a great story, not focusing on teaching a lesson. Use conflict. Make sure you have a plot. Let your characters get into trouble, and then let your characters get out of trouble themselves so that the adults don't come to the rescue. You can make some money off of it, but don't expect to get rich, and certainly don't expect to get rich quickly. Take time to learn your craft. Don't simply write one story and start looking for a publisher right away. Study, learn, get critique feedback, maybe hire someone to do a professional critique of your work, get better, and then worry about publishing in the future. And there are plenty of resources out there. You can contact me through my website contact page. I do offer critiques of picture books and novels and nonfiction. You can also visit my blog where I share writing tips. I don't post on that blog very often these days, but there's a lot of material from past years which you can go through. So that is it for screen sharing and for my talk today. So I hope that you have maybe learned something new. I'm sorry we can't take questions because this is a recording, but I hope that you will join me on May 2nd for the live workshop. And you can also contact me through my website if you'd like more help in another way. Thanks for joining me.